Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's webinar and the history of the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us for tonight's presentation, Michigan Football Game Films 1930 to 1986. I'm Gary Kranz. I'm pleased to be joined by our presenters tonight, my colleagues from the Bentley, Brian Williams and Greg Kinney. I want to begin by saying on behalf of Brian, Greg, and myself that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the university were made possible by cession of lands by Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the College at Detroit so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of Indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. Now, Michigan football is, as we know, an integral part of how we think about the University of Michigan experience. It was not always so. In the late 1800s, there was resistance to the growth of the sport on campus, and in particular, as time went on, to its increasing professionalization. But for at least 120 years, football has been a significant part of the character of the institution. And tonight, we will be looking at the Bentley Project to make a significant part of that history available through the digitization of game films. Our presenters are two individuals deeply involved with that effort, Greg Kinney and Brian Williams. Brian is Assistant Director and Archivist for University History at the Bentley Library. He joined the Bentley in 1984. Prior to coming to the Bentley, Brian was an Assistant Archivist at Oberlin College. He holds a master's degree in Information and Library Science from the U of M School of Information and a bachelor's degree in History from Hope College. He also studied at Muskingum University. Brian specializes in the history of the university, including athletics, and is currently leading a project on African American students at Michigan, something you will want to keep an eye out for when that is ready to become public. Greg Kinney is an archivist at the Bentley Historical Library with the University History Program. He is the archivist for the Bentley's large collection of athletic department records and athletics-related collections, a position partially funded by the athletics department. Greg joined the Bentley staff in 1988 after completing master's degrees in history and in library science and archives administration at U of M. He received his undergraduate degree in history from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. He is responsible for the athletic content on the Bentley website, and he is working with Brian on the African American Student Project. I believe that Brian is going to start us off, so please, Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. Greg and I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the treasure trove of digitized Michigan football game films now available online through the Bentley Historical Library. It's an amazing resource representing six decades of Michigan football. It also reflects a significant archival stewardship. Film requires a considerable amount of care and specialized handling and storage. Digitizing film is not quick and easy either. It involves a lot of time and resources to create and manage preservation copies and use copies. Today, Greg and I are going to talk about Michigan football films in the archives, how they came to the Bentley Library, and the years-long effort to identify, select, and repair the films prior to digitizing them. You'll get an overview of the digitization process and learn about some of the enhancements made to the user experience, or what I like to call Greg's perfect pandemic project. In March 2020, when COVID-19 stay-at-home orders forced the Bentley to close, Greg had the foresight to load a hard drive with copies of recently digitized football films. He took the hard drive home with him as we settled into remote work. While most of us struggled to adapt to working from home, Greg was all set up to watch football films. As he watched, he added notations, identified key players and scoring plays. He also created a portal to make the films more accessible, with box scores and additional context. And a bit later, we'll have a demonstration of that portal and show some highlights from the films. But now I want to cover some of the basic information on the films we digitized. These are not the highly produced films we're used to seeing on network broadcasts on a fall afternoon, featuring multiple camera angles and replays. These films are considered coaches' films. That means they were filmed using a single 16mm camera mounted on the press box. The camera was turned on before the play started and turned off when the play ended. As a result, the games run about 25 to 45 minutes long on average. They're silent films, with the exception of some films from the late 1950s and after, with voiceovers added. The games were filmed in black and white until the late 1960s, when color became more standard. The games were filmed primarily to benefit coaching and allow evaluation of individual plays and players. Players and coaches studied the film to note tendencies, evaluating positioning and execution. In this image with the slide, you can see Bo Schembechler and Gary Moeller using film, studying it with a little projector. Multiple copies were made so that the film could be divided into separate reels for offense, defense, and special teams for detailed study. Copies of films were also exchanged with other teams, as opponents were obligated to share or trade copies of recent games for scouting purposes. Many of the films in the archives are labeled as trade copy. Starting in the late 1950s, the Michigan Alumni Association sent game films to alumni clubs across the country to show at alumni gatherings, especially in regions where Michigan games were not routinely televised. Many of the film reels were stored in well-used shipping containers bearing many different alumni club labels and addresses. Phase 1 of the digitization project included reels from 420 games dating from 1930 to 1986. A second batch, representing another 125 games, was disrupted by COVID-19 and is yet to be digitized. The second batch includes scattered games from the 1950s to 1979 and all games from 1987 to 1989. The athletic department switched to videotape after the 1989 season, so the last films on 16 millimeter are from that 1989 season. The films currently available online include partial games from the early 1930s. Those games are often missing one or more film reels, so they're very incomplete. Games between 1937 and 1941, roughly the Tom Harmon years, about half the games had extant film and have been digitized. From 1942 to 1986, nearly all of the games have film available. Unfortunately, some of the films were cut up for highlight reels, leaving gaps in the films, and Greg will talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm going to turn things over to Greg now, and he'll tell you more about the film prep work and the digitization project. But first, he'll share a little bit about the earliest films of Michigan football. So take it away, Greg.
I think we've lost Greg for just a minute, and I think he's trying to reconnect. So
Okay.
let's give him just a moment.
Yeah.
So what was the origin of the project? I mean, aside from it being Greg's perfect pandemic work, I mean, where did the idea come from?
Yeah, we wanted to digitize these game films for a long time. We'd done a lot of one-offs as a need came up, a significant game, we'd get a request and it would just be sent out as a single film. But we had hundreds of these films sitting around. They got transferred gradually from a number of sources. And we waited till we had the capacity to do a large-scale digitization project and kind of take these on as a whole. So it was really having resources, a hefty curation department that could help manage the process of working with the vendors, lining up the vendors, and getting the films prepped and ready. But some of the films had been at the Bentley since, I guess, 1993 is when the first reels started coming over from the athletic department.
Okay, looks like Greg is coming back in, so thank you.
Yeah. So I think we're about to get queued up to the earliest football film we have. It actually predates this project, which we were talking about from 1930. But this is a really early kind of one-off film that's very unique.
Yes, so I'd like to talk briefly about, before we get to the coaches film, to some of the earliest football game films we have. And the earliest one is a game from 1904 against the University of Chicago. Chicago and Michigan were the great rivalries in the West at that time. And the 1904 game in Ann Arbor featured some filming done by the Thomas Edison Company. They sent a crew out from New Jersey to film the game at Regents Field. So if you
So I guess I can talk a little bit about this. If
Go ahead, Ryan.
Sure. Yeah, this film was found in the Library of Congress. That it was one of 3 films identified as films from 1903, but the U of M game was incorrectly identified, and it's actually a 1904 Chicago game here, because we identified it by the stands. You can kind of see the Regent's Field in the background, and it was shot by the Edison Company. They came here. It was a fairly large production. They tried filming a couple games in 1903, a Princeton game. Bad weather conditions made that one kind of a difficult go, and so they tried to set up 1904. It was heavily advertised. They're going to show it at the Temple Theater in Detroit. There's a Michigan Daily article that talks about it being really the first successful football game film, and cited that the other Princeton game and one other had been filmed under fairly poor conditions. But it's pretty neat snippet of football. You show how brutal it is, because that snippet showed a couple players being carted off that just really got knocked out of the game, and they're being kind of towed off. One guy's kind of dizzy and wobbling as he goes along.
So Greg,
yes, am I back live?
Yes, you're live, Greg. So go ahead.
I was just talking a little bit about the Edison film.
Okay. So after the Edison film, so we have that short film, and then there's also a film that was done in 1927-28 by the university, a series of movies that were taken. We think this footage of Michigan Stadium dedication comes from that part of that project. And is that film ready to go or not? So the next films that we have really become what we call the coaches' films. These were shot, like Brian said, with a single camera from the press box, and they were designed really for instructional purposes for the coaches mostly. The players would study the film, and coaches would use it to devise tactics. And over the years, it became a much more elaborate system in which each team would film their games, and they would trade them with opposing coaches, or other schools would use them for scouting purposes. So other teams would send copies to Michigan. Michigan would send copies of our games to the other schools. So this clip we'll show here is from the 1947 Rose Bowl game. It's the group was known as the Mad Magicians. Lots of intricate maneuvering in the backfield, as you'll see here. The quarterback rarely touched the ball. It was snapped directly usually to the fullback. And then what they called the spinner plays, where he would turn one way or the other, hand off, or take the ball in for himself. Here, this is Bob Weisenberger scoring touchdowns against Southern California.
You want to shift over to a little bit about the digitization project, Greg, and
yeah, let me see if I can.
Is
my slideshow available there again? Yeah. The films came to the Bentley from the athletic department in 1993. Is when we got the first batch of them. It was when the Bentley really started its close relationship with the athletic department. It was right also at the time when the original Schembechler Hall Museum was being developed. The so myself and several other students at the student archivists at the time went down to the athletic department, and the larger reels were stored in the basement of Weidenbach Hall, and others were stored at the football office in Schembechler Hall. So we loaded them up, took them over. Originally, they were stored for the Bentley's purposes at the Argus building, what was the home of the Michigan Media, the university's television studio. The Bentley had acquired the Michigan Media Archive, and we had storage room there. So everything initially went there. And let's see, just one quick here. Maybe I can share something. Brian, do you want to talk for just a minute? Let me get my share back up.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, how we got the game films, that was they came over from the Sports Information Office, the first shipment, about 500 reels in 1993. And then later that year, 1993, we got another 1,500 smaller reels that came over from the football video office in Schembechler. Those were more the cut up, smaller game reels. And we compiled an inventory, and by we, I really mean Greg, an inventory of a FileMaker database listing all the films based on the information that we had on the film canister, or we could read from the header. Oftentimes it wasn't entirely accurate or complete information, so there was a fair amount of work in that part. In 1997, we got another 300 copy prints from the U of M Alumni Association. These were the films that had been sent to the Michigan alumni clubs across all across the country to be shown, in the days before the games were routinely televised. So these films were all stored, as Greg was saying, in the Michigan Media Facility space. And once we put an addition on the Bentley Library in 2004, we were able to move those films from the Michigan Media space, from the Argus building, and consolidate them here in the Bentley Library, which made working on them a lot more feasible, having them as an entire batch. And so we'd provided limited access to the films, on-demand conversions to videotapes, a lot of one-offs. I think I'd kind of mentioned with talking with Gary. Some of that was done with the Michigan media staff, and then some commercial vendors in the area helped. And but yeah, a lot of the early requests were just for the big rivalry games, notable games, the 1969 Michigan-Ohio State game, Rose Bowl games. But occasionally we'd get a stray request for somebody that wanted to film an unlikely game, a blowout, either a Michigan lost or blew out the opponent. And some of these requests were interesting. Somebody once said they wanted to see this mid-1960s game because it's where they blew out their knee and were injured, and they'd never seen it. So that was an unusual request, and one of the kind of an example of these one-off requests that we've had. But I might start a little bit with talking about preparing for the digitization. I alluded to a little bit of that. We started a FileMaker database using the identification that was on the original canister, and or sometimes it would be a note. Sometimes game notes would be inside the film canister. They often came in these metal cans. The trick was trying to identify the game, the opponent, if home, away. We had to use a lot of parallel resources, media guides, game programs, newspaper coverage to make this all happen. We had reels, as I mentioned, came from multiple sources. So they came from the athletic department itself, some from the video office, and then these alumni association. So part of the process was trying to sort out the best films, the best copy of the films. And some had been well used, some had been really cut up, some had been cannibalized for different highlight reels for different purposes, a compilation of touchdowns. So there was a fair amount of repair work involved in these. Some of these were adding leaders and headers, splicing things together, repairing, weak cement splices. Sometimes we try and find missing footage, restore missing footage from various copies from these. Copies have been cut up for offense, defense, or special teams. Between the three of them, we might be able to cannibalize an entire film. So that was part of it. We added basic description and comments on conditions in the database. We're talking about the one slide back, Greg, I think.
Okay.
So kind of showing that digitization setup. I think go back maybe 2 slides. Yeah, there. I had just kind of talked through acquiring. Yeah, you can talk about the setup there with the Cinescan.
Okay. Yeah, so we used the Cinescan machine that we'd acquired. It's designed to treat film safely. We didn't want to run that older film through a projector. So this small video screen is what we used to preview the films. And as Brian said, a lot of the films needed some repair. Leader trailer needed to be added. We would come across a lot of times where a film was broken and simply repaired with Scotch tape or masking tape. So there was a lot of cleaning and repair involved with that. And then the final stage was to combine all those small reels, one reel per quarter, into one single reel for the game. And then they were all then stored on a core, taken off the metal or plastic reels that they were on, and put on a film core. And then everything was rehoused in a new archival container. One of the things Brian mentioned about plays being clipped out for highlights, oftentimes we'd be watching a film and Michigan would be marching down the field, and all of a sudden they'd be kicking the extra point. These are used to make highlight films. Sometimes the clips got put back in, sometimes not. Occasionally we had duplicate copies of film where we could restore it. One of the interesting little anecdotes that we learned was that Michigan had made a highlight film for Tom Harmon with all 33 of his touchdowns. And his son, Mark, the actor, recalled that when he was growing up, they used to watch that all the time, and that he was 10 years old before he realized that his dad had ever been tackled and thought he scored a touchdown every time he touched the ball. So the digitizing process itself, we then worked with the Bentley's curation staff for the final packing and shipping of the films to a commercial vendor in Covington, in Covington, Kentucky. Now, they were, we had done work with them before, and they were specialized in archival quality film preservation and audiovisual conversion. So on their end, they would do some additional inspection and cleaning, and they would then digitize it to the Bentley's specifications. And in the process, they would collect and record all kinds of technical metadata, both about the films and the digital files they were producing. So the products they provided us included digital frame images, literally a digital image for every single frame in the film. Then they provided an uncompressed MOV format file, which is sort of like the master file. And those would run up to 12 gigabytes per film in size. And then there was also a MP4 format film, which was the access file, or the file that is actually streamed. The final stage when the digital files came back to us was a quality control procedure that the curation staff did. They would open and inspect every film to make sure it met the technical standards we'd set, that everything seemed to be working properly. And then they would again make notes, and if there was anything that needed to be redone, they would arrange for it to be for scene savers to rescan the film. So the storage and access for the video is managed by the university's information technology services. Everything is stored there and backed up by them. And the streaming file that you can view publicly is managed by ITS through their My Video streaming service. The Bentley uses My Video for all of its audio and visual presentations or material that we have online. And we've branded our version of it as the Bentley Digital Media Library. It's a very nice system, but the search and browse features of it are not the best, especially when you're dealing with lots of similar content. And so what we decided to do was to create a separate portal that would provide a easier and more direct access to the individual films. And the curation staff loaded the materials into the DDML, and the site went public in June of last summer. But as we were working on his films, we started thinking about what would be the best way, or how could we enhance the user's experience. As you saw in some of those early films, it's often hard to tell which team is which. The uniforms are very similar, and for a while, the numbers didn't stand out very well. They were small. They're sometimes almost the same color as the jersey. And most of these films are silent, so there's no one telling you what you're watching. And even the scoreboards in those early days simply said home and visitor, so you couldn't be absolutely certain who you were watching. And, unless you were a real hardcore Michigan fan, you might not know that the star halfback in the mid 40s was number 40, but you might not know that in 43, number 40 was Elroy Hirsch, and in 44, it was Bob Nussbaumer. And so Bentley already had a roster database for all the teams for all the years. And so thought, well, why not provide that as an additional benefit so the user could figure out who was who by the numbers. We also had digitized the box scores and play-by-plays for the games. And the Bentley also hosts the Michigan Daily Digital Archive, and the Alumnus magazine, which carried game reports for many years, was also available digitally. So I thought, why not combine all these into a single portal that would allow the user both to watch the game, to figure out who's playing, who's scoring which plays. And then the other thing that we did, which Brian said was part of my COVID project, was to annotate the films with the major scoring plays and other significant plays, and provide a time code. So if a user could go directly to a specific play, if they were really interested in Bob Chappia's touchdowns in 1947, they could go directly to them in each of the online films. So I think Brian is going to actually give a little demonstration of the portal and how it works and how it provides access to the videos.
Yeah, this is what the Michigan football game film portal looks like. It's arranged by season and by game and opponent by date. And you'll see a lot of things like 1930. You can click on the team roster, and that will actually bring up the entire roster of the 1930 team. It includes players that were freshmen, freshman reserves, people that didn't letter. A lot of the names don't even have a number. But let's click on one of those rosters. And so this gets into that database, and it shows the section here with numbers is when it's a little more useful, when you see numbers on the game films. But a lot of these players in this database, they were AF or freshman reserve, basically, and so they weren't going to get into games. But this is a lot of the context that can add to that. I was going to feature a 1938 game that's Michigan State. And so this is what it comes up. You get the game starts playing. You can see some of Greg's annotations at the bottom. It says the opening kick, MSC quick kick, first U of M series missing. So some of those things are not present in the film. It just didn't exist in the copy that we had. But other things, a touchdown, Paul Cromer run. So there's been some things added. Michigan versus Michigan State here, and a little title card shows that. You can see some of the pregame action, players warming up. This is Michigan State warming up in the end zone. See the bands going by. Greg's count, the portal also includes these links to the Michigan Alumnus, the Michigan Daily, and box scores. And so if you want to read about the game, then you can see, well, spoiler alert, Fighting Varsity defeats State by 14. There's some pretty interesting descriptions of the game in here. It's a significant game in a number of ways, in part because this was Fritz Chrysler's first game as Michigan head coach, 1938. And there's a paragraph in this Michigan Alumnus account that I want to read just to help you get in the mood to watch that game. It says, State came to Ann Arbor the decided favorite. The boys from Lansing and their cocky adherents were about to win their 5th consecutive game over the Wolverines. Of this, they were sure. Nearly 20,000 State rooters were in the stands. Before the game, their cheerleaders paraded about the field with a casket labeled Michigan. As you go on and read the account, you'll hear about some of the star players in there. Forrest Avashetsky, they describe as the star German from Detroit, who had been labeled last year the one-man gang. Paul Cromer is in there, scores several touchdowns. Tom Harmon is described as the well-publicized Harmon, but he didn't record too many vital stats in this game. But being able to see this game, read the box scores, the Michigan Daily coverage of the game, for example, we can zoom in the account. There's a Michigan Daily includes a play-by-play of the Michigan victory by quarter, tells us what happened, plays off right tackle, but how the kickoff was received, how it was stopped. So these resources really add some context to it. I'm going to read one last piece from that 1940 Michigan alumnus account. It said, since we already saw the spoiler alert, said the Wolverines completely outplayed the confident and capable Spartans from East Lansing. In not a single department of the football category did the men from upstate show superiority over Fritz Chrysler's first Michigan varsity. I want to point out another little feature on this, the video viewer, is this speed. So you can control the playback speed. And so some of these films are at an uneven speed, filmed a little bit fast or a little bit slow. So you can actually slow it down, watch it at 3/4 speed. You can speed it up and watch it at 1.5 speed. Greg was talking, and we showed a highlight earlier of the Mad Magicians from the 1948 Rose Bowl. There's some really deft ball handling in the backfield, and actually slowing it down is you can see the spinning backs and try and track whoever has the ball. There's some true sleight of hand in that backfield for those games. But it's just it's a really neat portal having all these resources that tie together. That you have the kind of the cheat sheet with the rosters to see who was in the game. The write-ups, the account, the box scores. We go down to some of the later games. Let's see, I'm scrolling into the 60s. We'll pick another first, Vanderbilt. And so it's got a box score that'll pop up. And it'll actually show, this is a more detailed play-by-play. This is September 20, 1969. Michigan is playing Vanderbilt. It's Bo Schembechler's first game as head coach at Michigan. We get the weather conditions, overcast, mild temperatures, the wind, and then Bo Schembechler's debut, his first play. What do you think it is? Garvey Craw at left tackle for 1 yard, a running play, followed by another running play. This time the right tackle for 3 yards, and then a pass. So 2 runs and a pass. Don Moorhead to Glenn Dowdy for 4 yards, but they had to punt. But all these resources really add value to the films. So you can see, if you want to watch the 1969 Vanderbilt clips, this is the play-by-play that goes along with it. So all these things are really are complementary and add a lot of value. So this was, part of Greg's pandemic project was putting this all together. And it's, I just really want to emphasize what a wonderful resource that is, complete with you can click on the films, you can click on the game write-ups, the box scores, and then that little feature to be able to speed up and slow down films is great, especially for those early ones. Some of when it's really hard to identify players and the action. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Greg, to that description of the portal.
Yeah, there is in the feature where you can go to full screen too, so you can get a very enlarged view of the game. And the ones that are appear to be sort of in slow motion or semi-slow motion, the technical term for that is overcranked. The reference going back to the old days when the cameras were literally hand cranked, and we're not sure if it was intentional to do that, but so when they played back they were at slightly slower speed, which certainly would have made it easier for the coaches to use them for demonstration purposes, especially before projectors had sophisticated back forward and slow motion features.
Yeah, here's a little snippet of one of the 1933 games that has some of that, and it's a little bit jerky. You can see. So this is kind of fast. So this is where slowing it down is kind of helpful to try and identify what's going on.
So kind of the criteria I used for, annotating the films was certainly any touchdown plays. And then usually for, any pass or running play of, 10 to 15 yards or more seemed like it would be worth noting. Did note some significant defensive plays as well.
But I think, as you said, Greg, a lot of the challenge in these early games in particular was trying to figure out who's who and who was in a lighter jersey, darker jersey, or what. So how did you end up
for
doing
some of those
that?
ones? There's a specific note saying, some of it was, I would go back to the Michigan Daily article, the alumnus magazine, and figure out who the players were. The box scores for those early games are literally just simply box scores. They don't give you a real play-by-play. So for those, it was just close watching and comparing the notes to what the Michigan Daily and the alumnus magazine said.
Yeah. I think we want to move to some of the other highlights, Greg?
Yeah, we can move to some of those highlights again.
Yeah, we found a lot of some interesting highlights and some true surprises, and so it isn't just football. There were some things outside of football that showed up in these highlights, and there were some interesting things with cheerleaders, just some sideline actions.
Yeah. So this here is from the 1942 Minnesota game. That's the Minnesota cheerleaders at Minnesota. And I'm not certain, but I think it's possible that one of those Minnesota cheerleaders is Newt Loken, the longtime Michigan gymnastics coach. He was a gymnast and cheerleader in the early 40s at Michigan or at Minnesota. And even if he's not in the picture, that stunt is surely in the spirit of Newt Loken.
Yeah, did they get the guy over this time? Touchdown. Got the cheerleader over the crossbar.
And that move actually has a name. It's known as the Herky, named after a cheerleader from Iowa. So if you just want to scroll up the next video, this is from the 1939 Yale game. There was a reunion of all the Michigan M-men, or football players, an anniversary of Michigan's Big Ten championship. All the players formed the Block M, and this is Louis Elbel, composer of the Victors, leading the band in his composition. And let's go ahead with the next one too. This is the Michigan Marching Band in 1937 forming the Script, Ohio. Michigan had introduced it in 1932, and I think that may be the first film of the Script, Ohio. Ohio State says they don't know that for sure if they have anything before 1939 or so. It's, the stationary Script, Ohio, but Ohio still does always has a bit of envy that it was actually Michigan who introduced their trademark formation. And just go ahead with the next one, Fuad.
Hello there. This is Paul Williams, and here I am in the press box at Ann Arbor, ready to bring you the Michigan State game for your Ford dealer.
If you'll kindly look down here, my friend, I think that you will find that your brakes need some adjustment, and they need to be relined.
So that was none other than Ted Giesel, Dr. Seuss, who was working as a commercial artist at the time. We have about, I think, 4 different commercials that were shown as part of those delayed broadcast games in the mid-1950s. Those films were essentially the same coach's films that they just did a voiceover and then broadcast. Occasionally, they would cut out some plays to keep the length down to the 30-minute slot they had on television. And then you can go ahead and run our next one too. This one, some of you may remember Band Day. It was started by William Ravelli in 1948, although Don Canham sometimes claimed credit for it. They would get as many as 15 high school bands and performing. The largest figure I've seen is 13,000 students, high school students performing at halftime. There's no sound for this clip, which may be good since it's hard to say what 13,000 high school band members might be like. They held Band Day through the early 1970s until Bo Schembechler started filling up the stadium, and Don Cannon wasn't willing to give away 13,000 seats every week or once a year. So we can go down to this clip. This brings, some of you may recognize that. That's Jim Harbaugh to Bob Colasar, 1985 Ohio State game.
Or John Colasar.
John Colasar, I'm
son
sorry.
of Bob. Son of Bob. Yeah. I had occasion to meet the Ohio State defensive back, Sonny Gordon, that came in and just lit Harbaugh up after he got that throw off to Colasar. It was really interesting to hear the Ohio State perspective. He just got chipped by the fullback. Had the pleasure of meeting Sonny Gordon, a really nice guy, and but still, thinks they should have won that game.
And then I think we have one more clip to show. So this is a compilation film I put together of possibly the greatest individual day ever at Michigan Stadium. It's Ron Johnson in the 1968 Ohio State game when he scored 5 touchdowns and ran for, I forget the exact total now, but I believe it's still the all-time rushing record for Michigan, a single game record. And just by chance, I was at the game at Madison this year and was walking to the game and saw a woman wearing a Johnson number 40 jersey. And so I asked if that was for Ron Johnson. And he said, yes, he was my father. So I had a nice brief conversation with Ron's daughter. And that design in the end zone is one of the few times that Michigan actually had colored end zones. But the next year, of course, the artificial turf came to Michigan Stadium. So I think that is the end of our clips. Once, kind of as the wrap up to this, that we, once all those films were digitized, the original digitized films were then stored in our cold room where they will be preserved. Hopefully we will not actually have to pull them out to redigitize them at any point, but they're, at least now, they're very accessible, much more than they ever were before. And we're really anxious and pleased that people have shown a lot of appreciation for having them online already.
That's fantastic. Thank you both for the presentation. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Glad we got the I'm glad we got the clips in then at any rate. Clearly it's a fantastic resource, and the amount of work that you've put into this to connect all of these archival materials together to really turn it into something that's really usable, I think, is wonderful. I got to say, I also like the stories you have about connections that you made with people at these different places. We think about always, of course, you go anywhere in the world basically, and you can run into somebody wearing something that's Michigan, but it doesn't always it isn't always somebody with the other team, right? So anyway, that's great. I thought first of all, I'll say to the audience, please put your questions into the live chat on YouTube, and we will get to those shortly. But maybe just a little bit of discussion first, and I thought maybe we could cover just 3 areas kind of quickly. First of all, we know that, technology, the advances in technology often lead to changes and advances in a sport, right? Mm-hmm. And so here we have this relatively new technology being used in the early 20th century. Do you know when filming of team these kinds of films, coaches' films began, and who brought it to U of M?
Most of the films, like from other archives that I've seen, are from the late 1920s, early 1930s. And in fact, the Ohio State 1930 film that we have, I think actually is an Ohio State film originally. But it was certainly for Michigan was Harry Kipke, who was, came on the coaching staff in 29. And that's really when Michigan began to apparently systematically film games, although we have very few complete games until about 1937, bits and pieces from games in 32 and 33, nothing at all from 1934. And then it's really about 1942 when we start to get pretty complete coverage of all the games. But as far as, the technology, you can see some of the both apparently in the equipment when it's kind of lenses get better and they're more ability to zoom in and capture close plays. And the cameramen actually, they get better at following plays, especially long runs or pass plays. In the early days, you'll maybe see the quarterback, then you'll see the end or, catching the ball and being tackled. You rarely see that kind of intermediate stuff. And one of the things they particularly had a hard time, following punts and kickoffs, but punts in particular. And it seems like sometimes on sunny days, they would actually follow the shadow of the ball on the ground to the receiver rather than try to follow it through the air.
That's great.
Right.
And this was just one camera, right? So it's not like
not
like you had a control room where somebody's
right.
saying switch to camera 2, which is the one that's got the ball in view.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. I noticed that some games have more than one film. Why is that?
Well, some of them we digitized. If we happen to have both a color and a black and white copy, and if one was more complete than the other, we'd digitize both of them. Sometimes if there may be a slight difference in the black and white and the color copy. And like for the 1942 or the 48 Rose Bowl, there are two different films. One of them has slightly more different footage than the other. It includes more halftime and post-game stuff. And they're shot from a slightly different angle than the press box. So if there was something significant, we would do that. And then for those films in the 1950s that were delayed broadcast on TV, we would do the original film of the silent version of it, and then also the one that had the audio with it, because oftentimes, as I said, they would have to cut out a few plays or some boring plays to get it down to the half-hour time slot they had on television.
That's good too. So maybe now we could talk a little bit about about the game as it gets revealed in this, or not just maybe even the game, but the things that also happen on the field. I mean, the stuff with the cheerleaders and band day. That's fantastic. But for those at home who maybe are taking notes and want to know what film to look at, when does the winged helmet make its first appearance in one of these films?
Yeah, well, as Brian mentioned, the Michigan State game, the opening game for the 1938 season is when Fritz Chrysler brought the winged helmet.
But that Michigan State game was the debut of that.
Yeah, but if you look close, Michigan State at that time was wearing a version of a winged helmet as well. Didn't have the front to back stripes with it, but I mean, that was a feature of the helmet. It was kind of a protective padding thing on the forehead. And a lot of schools wore them, but only Michigan, carried it forward once its original function was gone. Michigan kept it as the symbol for the team.
Is it right that am I right that that part of the padding was painted? Was that a Michigan thing, or was that true of other teams as well?
Other teams, some of them would seem to be white, but Michigan State's was green, I believe, at that time.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. What about the game itself? I mean, you mentioned some things. I mean, the great clips there. I forgot, I believe from the 40s with the different formations. But what can you learn about the evolution of the sport? Formations, tactics, things like that.
One thing that's really noticeable from the early films is how the role of punting has changed. Quick kicks on second, even first down were very common. If the team had the ball, inside its own 10-yard line, rather than risk a fumble at that point, they would just kick it away on first down. And I mean, that was even going back to the Yost style of play that, the punt was sort of a offensive weapon that you would use it to, you know, kind of a battle for field position using the punt rather than just running your 4 plays or 3 plays and then punting.
Mhm.
That and really with Chrysler, the big innovation is the development of the single wing offense that you saw in that clip from the 48 Rose Bowl, where the ball would be hiked directly to the fullback, and the quarterback was primarily a blocker. He would call the plays, and then he'd line up sort of in the now current quarterback position, but then they would shift out into that single wing, and he would move over to behind the tackle and become a guard or oftentimes the receiver.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Forrest Devashevsky was, the quarterback for Michigan in the 39-40, but he was also one of the leading receivers. And I don't know that he threw a pass as quarterback his
Yeah.
whole career.
Well, clearly, yeah, lots of those
Yeah,
sorts of changes. I mean, you
yeah,
know, you typically would not find quarterbacks blocking anymore, right?
yeah,
So,
And I think the
right,
Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl 2 years ago used one of those plays from the
yeah,
1948 Michigan team. One of
oh, is
the
that right? I
yeah,
mean, oh,
yep,
that's
yeah.
great.
It's
That's great.
it's what the pros at that were referring to as the Wildcat formation, and essentially it was a single wing formation.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, John Crick, Michigan football fan, writer, and authority on Willie Heston. He's the one who identified Willie Heston scoring the touchdown in that first play, but he went in and analyzed that play and actually took a clip from that 48 Rose Bowl play and said, well, here's where the origin of that Kansas City play was.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Are there any games that are missing that you really wish you had?
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be nice to have some complete games from the 32, 33, national championship seasons, be able to see some of the great players,
yeah. Chuck Bernard and some of the
Chuck Bernard, Harry Newman, who one was at that time called the Douglas Fairbanks Award, which is kind of the predecessor to the Heisman Trophy, was, Michigan's great All-American quarterback. Um, it'd
and
be
then the
nice to have
34
something.
season with Gerald Ford and
Yeah, it's,
Willis Ward.
they only won one game that year, and whether it's coincidence that no film survived or not, I don't
Yeah,
know, but we don't have any. Um, and then the Tom Harmon era, we're missing a number of games from that period. And I say one that we have a copy of, but we haven't digitized yet, is the 1969 Ohio State game. Our copy of that is just horribly scratched up from many, many viewings, I'm sure. And so we were kind of hoping maybe a better copy would turn up, or there are some techniques in the digitizing process that they can do to sort of minimize some of the effect of the scratches. But if we have to, we'll digitize our scratched up copy as it is.
Okay, but so this is a call to the audience. If anybody
Yes,
knows about a
yeah,
copy of the 1969
yeah.
Ohio State game film,
There,
please
yeah,
let us know.
there are some bootleg versions of the television broadcast
yeah,
of
with
it.
the
Oh,
broadcast out there. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've seen some of those.
yeah. Well, that presents different challenges.
Yeah,
traditions,
yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, what about the usage? I mean, how I mean, you said that there's been a good response to this, and how any trends that you're seeing in usage, or what's going?
Yeah, just our curation staff just generated some numbers for us, and um, so far they determined for the entire batch of films that there's been something like 14,500 views of the films, or people have at least, opened a film to take a partial look at it at least. Um, the system it's hard to track like where the usage is coming from just
Hmm.
because of the way it sets. But I do know that I've gotten some individual response from players. When the site launched in June, I happened to be working with a woman who manages what's called the um, Those Who Stayed club. It's a football alumni group, and so she sent out an email with a link to all 1,200 members of that group, and a lot of them took a look at it. I had responses. One was the one you mentioned, where one of the players, who didn't get in a lot of games, apparently said, "Well, now at least I can prove to my kids and grandkids that I did play football for Michigan." A couple commented that they had never seen the Ohio State game they played in,
Oh, okay.
because it was the last game of the season, and if they weren't going to a bowl game,
And yeah.
they had no reason to come back and study it. So a couple of them were really pleased to see that. And George Hoey, who was played in late 60s and was a longtime coach, sent a really nice note saying how much it meant to them and some of his teammates, especially, looking at the rosters and seeing all those names that some of whom were no longer with us. It was just a really emotional experience for him to go back and look at the films and read the accounts and, kind of relive those moments in his life.
That's great. That's great. So what's next? I mean, what about after 1986, and what other plans for the project?
Yeah.
Getting phase
Well,
two.
we have
underway,
phase two that we had a batch about ready to go out when the COVID shutdown hit. So I've got a few more films to get prepped for that. And that will take us, it'll fill in some of the blanks from particularly in the 1970s that weren't done. And then the films themselves run through 1989, through the 1989 season. And then technology switched over to videotape. So we'll complete that. The videotape digitization is a project that is something we intend to do at some point, but it's not on the queue. It's not in the queue quite yet. But another complication comes in about 1996, when the Big Ten Network was formed. As part of the agreement to form the network, all the schools agreed that the Big Ten Network would have the rights to all the game films. So we can't provide free access to the copies and stuff.
Right. Okay. And what other sports? I mean, I think you've said that there just isn't really this kind of collection of films from other Michigan sports.
Yeah, we have a small number of basketball films from the 1950s. So we got some of Ron Kramer and MC Burton, a few of the great stars from the 50s. There's bits and pieces, partial games. I think we have one complete game from the mid 60s, the Cassie Russell era. And again, a few little highlight clips here and there. And there's simply no film up until when videotape comes in the late 80s with, Gary Grant and then the Fab Five era. Mm-hmm. People insist that those games were filmed, but we just don't know for sure what became of them.
Right. Okay. Well, let's turn to we've got some questions coming in, so why don't we go to that? And again, just to remind people in the audience that you can enter your questions into the live chat. So here's one. I noticed the grid in the very earliest films. When did they drop the crossing lines? Oh,
that's kind of a tough one.
Oh, yeah. It was by 1910, I believe, around that era, when the literal gridiron was eliminated. And that part had to do with kind of the rules for passing, that in the early days, there was both a minimum and a maximum you could throw the ball. And so that gridiron is what kind of, helped them determine what was a legal pass at the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Well, we already talked about the 1969 OSU game. Anything in the works to colorize older game films?
Not on our end. There's no project that is. If the next Ted Turner of the world is out there somewhere, maybe. Yeah,
it doesn't feel that arkable to colorize the
Right.
original film. So.
There are a couple really remarkably high quality color films from the mid 1940s. I think it's like maybe a 44 Michigan State game or something, that for some reason a color copy was made, and it still has this really brilliant color to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. Does the Bentley have any film of the first time the Go Blue, M Club banner was used? Or do you know when it was first used?
Well, it was 1961 or 62.
Yeah, somebody did an article on it recently.
Yeah, I can't remember. We have on the Bentley website, there's something about it, I believe. But it depended. A lot of the films do begin with kind of the team coming out of the tunnel. And offhand, I can't remember when the first shot of the banner. I mean, the original banner was, not nearly as big as the current banner, but later on that they would almost always make sure that they got the team coming out and touch slapping the banner when that became a tradition.
Okay. Any footage of Bo's intro press conference with Bump and Don?
I've only seen still
There's
photos.
stills.
Or any press conference photos
Yeah,
or video,
yeah,
film?
yeah. There are some press conferences later on, and on some of those alumni association films that the alumni association would get copies of the film and then send them around to alumni clubs around the country. And for a couple of years, Bo would record a little intro for it, kind of talking about the game and what happened and everything. And we've digitized some of those, but those alumni films, since they were second or third generation, tended not to be as high quality.
Yeah.
But at some point, we may go back and kind of make a compilation of all of Bo's intro comments.
Okay. Not seeing any other questions at the moment. Any other last thoughts that either of you would like to give us about the project? I mean, it clearly it looks like a labor of love, and yeah, a great thing to occupy yourself during the pandemic, right?
I had a couple of students who helped me over the course of it, and one in particular watched a lot of films, did some splicing, and he was the envy of all of his roommates because, man, you're getting paid to watch football films.
That's great. Brian, any?
I know somebody, a backup quarterback, got in the 1961 Ohio State game. He's really anxious for us to get that second batch digitized because he came in through the final pass of the game, his only pass of his Michigan career, a 17-yard completion, and then time ran out, and it was a 50-20, I think, Ohio State loss. But he would love to see that pass, and so he's proud of that.
That's great. That's good.
And that is, a lot of the guys who only got in one or two games or, very briefly, it really means a lot to them to say, yeah, there's my contribution to Michigan football, even though it is only one time on the field. A reward for all those hours in practice.
Right. Another question that just came in. Do you ever work with other schools to fill in film holdings?
Yeah, we've had a little bit of discussion with Northwestern because they've had a pretty big digitization project for their films. And they've got a few of the scouting films as well, I think, that we sent them.
Yeah, we've been in touch with other schools. Northwestern actually has theirs mounted in YouTube now, is where they're using to. But yeah, we've talked to some people from Ohio State for some of the games we're missing and see if we can do kind of an exchange. We'll send you something you don't have if you'll send us something we need. Yeah.
Let's see. Now, so a couple more in. I noted that the 1947 Rose Bowl featured Michigan and USC in chromatic uniforms. Any idea when that ended, especially in the Michigan OSU series?
Yeah, that I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what they mean by chromatic uniforms.
That is both. Oh, I see. That is both teams wearing non-white uniforms.
Oh,
to distinguish. I mean,
I think, I think in the Rose Bowl, each team probably wore its home uniform, I think.
But was it was it the practice to have the white jersey versus the
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's into the 1940s. Everybody is still wearing the same slightly lighter or darker shade of brown, it seemed like, or blue. But some schools did start wearing. Michigan, in fact, when they played Navy in 1928 in Annapolis, the Michigan Daily has an account of the game that Michigan wore what it called canary yellow uniforms in deference to Navy's, having their own navy blue uniforms. And I think probably in the late 40s is when Michigan would start wearing a yellow or white jersey on the road.
Did television have anything to do with the way uniforms were, that kind of thing?
I don't know if it did, in fact.
Yeah. Okay.
But you mentioned made me think of one other thing to mention is in the late 50s and early 60s, there'd be a few films that were labeled wide angle, and it was they were filmed with a special lens. It was kind of a take part. Some of these were intended to be shown in movie theaters, and so it was part of the Cinerama panorama craze for the wide angle theater productions. And so they filmed it with these special, what they call an anamorphic lens. And if you don't have that lens to project it back, it has the wrong aspect ratio. And so when you look at it on a normal film, everybody looks like they're 7 feet tall and 150 pounds, real tall and skinny. But when they do the digitizing, they can use some techniques to bring it back to its proper aspect ratio, except that it's a very wide and not as high a frame when you look at it.
Okay. Yeah.
Thinking of the uniform history, there is a football historian, Greg Dooley, runs M. Victor's website. He has a very detailed uniform history timeline, so he can. That's probably the resource to go to for that. He's he's the guy.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Well, listen, this has been really great, Brian and Greg. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just remind us one more time, how do people get to this? It's you go to the bentley.umich.edu and then
go to the Bentley homepage, and one of the top links there is simply athletics, takes you to our athletic site, and on that main athletic page, there's a link to the football films.
Okay, thank you. So we'll look forward to advances on the project, and I think a lot of people will get a lot of great use out of it. So thank you. I want to thank Rob Havey for his behind the screen support for the webinar, and also the Michigan media team, which has managed the event. And thanks to the audience. This session will be available on our website with full closed captioning in a week or so. And also on the U of M YouTube. And I hope you will be able to join us on Thursday, November 11, when U of M alum and journalist Sarah Fitzgerald will discuss her book, Conquering Heroines: How Women Fought Sex Bias at Michigan and Paved the Way for Title IX. So until then, be safe and stay well, and good night. Thank you all.